Don't open that box alone. The electrician's voice was so serious that I stopped immediately. He was rewiring my late wife's workshop when he found a hidden box behind the wall. When we finally opened it, there was something inside that proved my wife's death was not an accident. And the evidence in that box was pointing towards someone I had trusted more than anyone else in my life. My name is Roland Mercer. I am 62 years old. I live in a stone-fronted house on the edge of Harwick, a mid-sized town in northern Ontario, where the winters come early and stay long, and most people know each other well enough to wave from across a parking lot. I have lived in this house for 24 years. My wife Sylvia died 16 months before the electrician found that box. She was 56 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as cardiac arrest, secondary to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle that her cardiologist told me had likely been developing silently for years. Sudden, he said, unpredictable. These things happen without warning in people who appear completely healthy. I had accepted that. I had built my grief around that explanation, the way you build a structure around a hole in the ground, not to fill it, but to keep yourself from falling in. That explanation was wrong. I need you to understand who Sylvia was before I tell you what was in that box, because without understanding her, none of what she did makes complete sense. And what she did was one of the most precise and courageous things I have ever encountered in my life. Sylvia Mercer was a cartographer by training and a restorer of antique maps by vocation. She worked from a small workshop at the back of our property, a converted outbuilding her father had helped us insulate and wire in the first year we bought the house. She spent her days at a drafting table under a north-facing skylight, working with magnifying lenses and fine brushes, restoring documents that were sometimes 300 years old. She was a woman who understood that small details contain the entire truth of a thing. A fold line in a 17th century chart told you how it had been transported. A water stain told you about the room it had been stored in. A deliberate erasure told you what someone had wanted to hide. She spent her professional life reading what careful people had tried to conceal. It did not surprise me later that she had applied the same skill to the last months of her own life. The workshop electrical had been a problem since the previous autumn. The outbuilding was original wiring, never fully updated, and two of the circuits had started tripping under normal load. A colleague at the Harwick Rotary chapter had recommended an electrician named Frank Duda, said he was honest, competent, and did not manufacture additional work. I called Frank in the third week of October, gave him the key to the workshop padlock, and asked him to assess and replace whatever needed replacing. I told him I would be away visiting my son in Sudbury for the long weekend. I told him to work at his own pace and call me if anything came up. He called me Saturday morning, not about the wiring. His exact words, delivered in a voice that was carefully controlled, the way voices get when the speaker is working to not alarm you before you are standing in front of them, were, "Mr. Mercer, I found something inside the north wall cavity when I opened it up. I think you need to come back and see it in person before I do anything else. And I would ask that when you come alone." I drove back 4 hours through early October rain with my hands on the wheel and my mind running through everything that statement could mean and arriving at nothing useful. Frank was standing outside the workshop door when I pulled in. He nodded when I got out of the car. He waited until I had walked all the way over. Then he said, "I want to show you before I explain anything. Come inside." The workshop smelled the way it had always smelled, linseed oil and old paper, and the faint mineral scent of the pigment powders Sylvia kept in small glass jars on the shelf above her drafting table. Frank had opened a section of the north wall, pulled back the insulation batting, exposed the old wiring behind it. And there, sitting on a small wooden platform someone had screwed directly into the wall stud between two joists, was a metal document case. Gunmetal gray, rectangular, the kind with a combination lock recessed into the front face, and a rubber seal around the lid to protect the contents from moisture. It had been placed there deliberately and secured so it would not move. It was not something left behind accidentally. It was something installed. "Ooh," Frank said. "It was set on that bracket when I opened the wall. I have not touched it. I thought you should see it exactly where it was before anything else happened." I crouched in front of it on the cold concrete floor of my wife's workshop. I looked at it for a long time. I knew the combination before I consciously decided that I knew it. Sylvia had used the same 6-digit sequence for everything that required a code. The date of a particular astronomical event she had been obsessed with since university. A full solar eclipse visible from our back garden in the second year of our marriage. I turned the dial. The lock opened. Inside there was a sealed plastic bag containing a USB drive. A second sealed bag containing what appeared to be a small glass vial with a rubber stopper, the kind used in laboratory settings, filled with a pale, straw-colored liquid. And beneath both of those, an envelope, cream-colored, my name on the front in Sylvia's handwriting. The R in Roland with the small serif she always added, a habit from her drafting work. The kind of precise flourish that had always been specifically hers. Frank Duda stood behind me and said nothing. I appreciated that more than I could have told him at the time. I did not open the envelope there. I thanked Frank, paid him for the weekend, asked him to finish the rewiring the following week, and to please not mention what he had found to anyone. He looked at me steadily for a moment and then said, "Mr. Mercer, I have been doing this work for 28 years. I find things in walls sometimes. I have never once discussed what I find with anyone who is not the homeowner. You have my word." I brought the case inside. I set it on the kitchen table. I made tea that I did not drink and sat across from what my wife had hidden inside our workshop wall and tried to prepare myself for what it was going to tell me. The rain was still coming down outside, running off the eaves in a steady stream that hit the stone path below, in a way I had heard 10,000 times from that kitchen and had never particularly noticed until that moment, when the sound of ordinary things felt suddenly very far away. I opened the USB drive first. I plugged it into my laptop and sat with what I found on it for the better part of 2 hours. Sylvia had been organized in her documentation the same way she was organized in everything. The drive contained 4 folders. The first folder was labeled Accounts and contained scanned copies of our joint investment statements going back 3 years. The second was labeled Correspondence and contained printed email exchanges saved as image files. The third was labeled Research and contained a series of documents I did not immediately understand, dense with technical and pharmaceutical language. The fourth folder contained a single file. It was a video recording, 43 minutes long, filmed on Sylvia's phone, propped at an angle on what I recognized as the shelf above her drafting table in the workshop. Filmed in this room, in the room where I was now sitting. I watched the video last. I want to explain what was in the other folders first, because the video only makes complete sense if you understand what came before it. The account statements in the first folder were our retirement investment portfolio, managed for 11 years by a financial advisor named Clifford Bain. Clifford had come to us through my oldest friend, a man named Dennis Hartwell, who had used him for years and described him as one of the most ethical people in the business. Clifford was 58 years old, heavy-set, with a careful manner and the habit of slightly over-explaining things in a way that had always read to me as thoroughness. He had been at Sylvia's funeral. He had stood beside me at the reception afterward and told me that she had been one of the most intellectually impressive clients he had ever worked with, and that he would miss their quarterly conversations. Sylvia had annotated the scanned statements in red ink, small, precise notations in the margins, the same handwriting she used on her restoration documentation when she was flagging something that required further examination. The first annotation appeared on a statement from 18 months before she died. She had circled an advisory fee of $7,800 and written beside it, "Not in original contract, check Schedule B." 14 months before she died, another circle. Transfer fee, $11,200. Beside it, no transfer occurred this quarter. 12 months before she died, portfolio management surcharge, $8,500. Beside it, a single letter, F. I did not understand the letter F until I read the correspondence folder. The correspondence folder contained printed exchanges between Sylvia and Clifford going back nearly 2 years. She had been asking him about the fee discrepancies directly, by email, in language that was polite and precise and that gave nothing away about the depth of what she was actually investigating. His responses were consistently reassuring. He referenced contract language she had apparently asked him to specify. He sent her pages she had requested. She had printed his responses and annotated them in the same red ink. On one of his explanatory emails, she had written, "The contract page he references does not appear in our signed copy. This page was added after we signed." The word "added" was underlined twice. The letter F in the margin of the statement, I understood when I found the research folder, stood for Clifford's wife, a woman named Frederica Bain, who ran what appeared to be a small wellness consulting business operating under 2 different registered business names. The research folder contains Sylvia's notes on those businesses, printed web pages, a photograph of a business registration document, and a timeline Sylvia had constructed by hand on 3 sheets of drafting paper, mapping the dates of the undisclosed fee transfers against the dates of payments into accounts registered to Frederica's businesses. The correlation across 11 separate transactions over 22 months was not coincidental. It was a pattern. Sylvia had drawn lines between the dates in red ink and written at the bottom of the 3rd page, "The money leaves our account and arrives in her account within 72 hours every time. This is not an error, this is a system." The total across all 11 transactions that Sylvia had documented, $96,000. I had to stand up and walk to the window. I stood there for several minutes. The rain had stopped, and the garden was very still and dark, and I stood looking at it and thought about 11 years of quarterly meetings with a man who had a cup of coffee in our kitchen more times than I could count, and had stood beside me at my wife's reception and told me she had been impressive and that he would miss her. Then I thought about the glass vial in the 2nd sealed bag, and I went back to the table and I opened the research folder again, and I read Sylvia's notes more carefully. Approximately 14 months before she died, Sylvia had begun experiencing symptoms: fatigue, occasional chest tightness, moments of breathlessness that arrived without exertion and left without explanation. She had gone to her GP, Dr. Margaret Foss, who had referred her to a cardiologist named Dr. Ibrahim Saleh after an ECG showed what he described as minor irregularities consistent with early hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. He had recommended monitoring, lifestyle adjustments, and a follow-up in 6 months. Sylvia had written in her research notes, dated 2 months before she died, "Dr. Saleh says the thickening has progressed faster than he would expect. He is adjusting my medication. I have not told him what I believe because I do not yet have proof he would accept." What she believed was this: approximately 15 months before she died, Clifford Bain had given her a gift. He had brought it to their quarterly review meeting in a small fabric pouch, said his wife Frederica had been promoting it through her wellness business, and had asked him to pass samples to a few clients she thought might benefit. It was a dropper bottle, unlabeled except for a small printed card describing it as a cardiac tonic, a concentrated herbal preparation formulated to support heart rhythm and circulation. Clifford had said his wife swore by it and had been distributing it to clients for 2 years with excellent reported results. Sylvia had thanked him and taken it home. She had been putting it in her morning juice for 14 months before she began to suspect. The suspicion began when she connected the timeline. The cardiac symptoms had started 3 months after she began the tonic. She had stopped taking it for 30 days as an experiment without telling anyone, and the symptoms had stabilized slightly. She resumed, and they worsened. She stopped again. The research folder documented this in clinical detail, dated entries over 6 weeks, written in the same methodical language she used to document the condition of a 300-year-old map. She treated her own body as evidence. Then she had the remaining liquid in the vial tested. She had found a private toxicology screening service in Toronto that accepted samples from individuals without institutional referral. She had sent the vial by courier under her maiden name. The results were in the research folder, printed and annotated. The screen compound was identified as a concentrated preparation containing cardiac glycosides derived from Digitalis lanata, the woolly foxglove plant. Cardiac glycosides in controlled pharmaceutical doses are used to treat certain arrhythmias. In uncontrolled sustained doses delivered over months to a person without a pre-existing cardiac condition, they progressively cause the heart muscle to behave in ways that are clinically indistinguishable from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. They cause the precise symptoms Sylvia had experienced. They cause the precise findings Dr. Sylvia had documented on her ECGs. And in a person whose cardiologist has already diagnosed what appears to be a developing cardiac condition, a sudden fatal arrhythmia caused by accumulated glycoside toxicity looks, at autopsy, like the natural progression of the disease that was already there. Sylvia had written at the bottom of the toxicology page, in handwriting that was slightly less even than usual, as though written quickly or with the weight of full understanding behind it. This is what he has been doing, and I have been taking it willingly for over a year. I have very little time to finish this correctly. I watched the video. 43 minutes. Sylvia sitting at her drafting table in this workshop, speaking directly into her propped phone with the north light behind her and the shelves of pigment jars visible over her left shoulder. She was thinner than I had noticed at the time. Her cheekbones were more prominent, and there were shadows under her eyes that I had attributed to tiredness and the progress of her condition. She was composed. Her voice was steady and careful and entirely her own. She walked through everything: the fee discrepancies, the contract pages that had not been in our signed copy, the correlation between the transfers and Frederica's business accounts, the tonic, the timeline of her symptoms against the timeline of the doses, the private toxicology results. She held the printed lab report up to the phone camera at one point and read the relevant section aloud slowly so that the words would be clear on the recording. She then addressed the investigation directly, speaking as though to a detective or a lawyer, telling them exactly where to find each piece of documentation, in what order it had been assembled, and what she believed it proved. Then she addressed me. She spoke for 6 minutes directly to me, and I will not describe most of what she said because those 6 minutes belonged to me alone. But near the end, she said this. She said, "Roland, I did not tell you while I could have, because I was not certain enough and because I know how much you trust Dennis, and I was not willing to destroy that for you on suspicion alone." Dennis told Clifford things about our finances that only someone very close to us could know. I do not believe Dennis understood what Clifford intended to do with that information. I believe he believed he was helping a friend build a client relationship, and I believe he has no idea what grew from that. But you will need to make that determination yourself. I am sorry I did not give you the chance to help me while I was still here. I ran out of time to be certain, and I chose certainty over speed, and I think that was the wrong choice. Please go to a lawyer first. Please do not go to Clifford alone. He is more dangerous than he appears, and he has had a long time to prepare for the possibility that someone would eventually find what I found. The recording ended. The workshop was silent. The north-facing skylight above Sylvia's drafting table showed a black square of October night sky. On her table, exactly where she had always left it at the end of a working day, her magnifying loupe was sitting in its leather case beside an unfinished restoration project. A partial coastal chart from the 1740s, with a water-damaged corner she had been stabilizing for 6 months and had not finished. She had not finished it. She had run out of time. I did not go to Clifford Bain. I want to be clear about that because the impulse was real and serious, and I sat with it in that workshop for long enough to understand exactly what it would cost me. Sylvia had told me not to. She had been right about everything else in that case. I was not going to override her final instructions because I was angry, and I was angry in a way that I had no previous reference point for. A slow and total anger that felt less like heat and more like pressure, building from the inside with nowhere to go. I held it and I drove to see a lawyer the following morning. The lawyer's name was Patricia Voss. She practiced criminal and civil litigation and had been recommended by a judge I knew through the Rotary chapter. I told her everything in one sitting with the USB drive and the case on her desk between us. She listened without interrupting for the better part of 90 minutes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Roland, I need the physical vial, the drive, and everything in that case to stay in my possession from this moment. Do not contact Clifford Bain. Do not speak to Dennis Hartwell yet. Do not contact the investment firm. I am going to make 3 calls today." The first call went to a detective at the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit named Detective Sergeant Paul Anwu. The second went to a forensic toxicologist at Queen's University named Dr. Catherine Mbeki. The third went to a forensic document examiner who specialized in financial fraud. Detective Anwu reviewed the materials within 10 days. Dr. Mbeki received the vial and Sylvia's full medical records and the private toxicology report and took 8 weeks before she submitted her findings. Her report confirmed the presence of cardiac glycosides at a concentration consistent with sustained subtherapeutic dosing over a period of 12 to 18 months. She noted that the pattern of cardiac changes documented in Sylvia's cardiology records was consistent with this exposure profile. She noted that glycoside toxicity presenting in this manner was routinely misidentified as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in patients with no prior cardiac history, particularly when the treating cardiologist had no reason to test for toxicological causes. She stated that in her professional opinion, the cumulative exposure documented in the vial, if administered over the period indicated by Sylvia's own records, was sufficient to cause fatal cardiac arrhythmia in a person with no underlying cardiac pathology. Sylvia had no underlying cardiac pathology. Her medical records from before she began taking the tonic confirmed this completely. Clifford Bain was arrested on a Tuesday morning in March at his office. The charges included fraud over $5,000, theft by a person in a position of trust, criminal negligence causing death, and administering a noxious substance. Patricia told me from the beginning that the last 2 charges would be the most difficult to sustain through trial, and that the defense would contest the causal chain between the tonic and the death at every point. I understood this. I had made my peace with the gap between what the evidence proved and what a court could declare before the trial began. The investigation into the financial fraud required an additional 4 months and uncovered that the unauthorized fees had totaled $112,000 over the full 11 years of the advisory relationship, not the $96,000 Sylvia had documented. She had found most of it. She had missed the earliest transfers from the first 2 years before her attention was drawn to the pattern. She had been that close. The document examination confirmed that 2 pages of our original advisory agreement had been substituted after signing. The original Schedule B had been replaced with a revised version containing fee authorization language that had not been in the document we signed. It had been done carefully, and the substitution had held for 11 years because neither Sylvia nor I had ever compared our copy page by page against the version Clifford retained. What the investigation also found, and this is the part I have spent the most time sitting with, concerned Dennis Hartwell. Dennis had been my closest friend for 20 years. He had introduced us to Clifford. He had been best man at our wedding. He had driven 3 hours to be at Sylvia's funeral and stayed for 4 days afterward because he said he did not want me to be alone in the house. He had sat in my kitchen every evening of those 4 days, and we had talked about Sylvia and about grief and about what a life looks like after the person who organized its center is gone. The investigation found that Dennis had been in serious financial difficulty for 3 years before Sylvia died. A private business investment that had collapsed and left him with debts he had been managing quietly and had not disclosed to his wife. He had been receiving payments from an account connected to Frederica Bain's second registered business. 11 payments over 26 months, between $1,500 and $4,000 each. He had told Clifford, over dinners and golf rounds and the ordinary intimacy of a 20-year friendship, detailed information about our financial situation, the size of our portfolio, the structure of our accounts, and critically, that Sylvia was the one who monitored everything closely and would need to be kept satisfied. Dennis told the detective that he had believed Clifford was going to identify billing opportunities and that Sylvia might not notice all of them. He said he had not known about the tonic. He said he had not known anyone was going to be harmed. He said he had told himself it was a financial matter between consenting adults and that he had needed the money and had not examined his own reasoning closely enough to see where it led. He said all of this in a formal interview with his lawyer present, and I have read the transcript and I believe that some of it is true. I have known Dennis Hartwell for 20 years. He stayed in my house for 4 days after Sylvia died. He sat in my kitchen and talked to me about grief. Sylvia had written about him in the video recording. She had said she did not believe Dennis had understood what Clifford intended. She had said she was not willing to destroy my friendship with him on suspicion alone. She had been more generous toward him than I have been able to be. She had been more generous toward him in the last weeks of her life, when she understood what had been done to her, than I have managed in the 16 months since I learned his name was in the detective's file. I am still working on that. I do not think it is the kind of thing that resolves cleanly. I think it is the kind of thing you carry and occasionally set down and pick back up and carry again. Clifford Bain was convicted on the fraud and theft charges after a trial that lasted 3 weeks. The criminal negligence charge resulted in a conviction on the lesser included offense. The administering a noxious substance charge was stayed on a procedural issue with the chain of custody on the original tonic bottle that Patricia explained to me carefully and that I understood intellectually and could not absorb emotionally. He was sentenced to 8 years. The civil action Patricia pursued in parallel resulted in a settlement that recovered the full $112,000 plus significant additional damages. I donated a portion to the cardiology research program at the regional hospital. I donated a portion to a toxicology education fund at Queen's University. It seemed right. Sylvia would have been precise about where the money went. I tried to be. Dennis Hartwell pleaded guilty to fraud and breach of trust. He received a suspended sentence in community service in exchange for his full cooperation. I have spoken to him once since the conviction, a brief exchange in a parking lot that neither of us planned. He started to say something. I told him I was not ready, and I walked to my car and I drove home. I do not know if I will ever be ready. I have stopped putting a deadline on it. I still live in the house on the edge of Harwick. Frank Duda finished the workshop rewiring the week after I returned from Patricia's office for the first time. He did clean work and he did not speak unnecessarily, and I paid him well, and we have remained in a kind of quiet mutual respect that does not require conversation to maintain. The workshop is open now. I go in there some evenings. I am not a cartographer and I do not have Sylvia's skill with a fine brush. But I have been sitting at her drafting table under the north skylight, and I have been reading about antique maps, the history of them, what the symbols meant, and why the cartographers made the choices they made about what to include and what to leave out, and how the edges of a map tell you as much about the mapmaker as the territory does. The unfinished coastal chart from the 1740s is still on the table. I have not touched it. I do not think I am the right person to finish it. I have been looking for a conservator who knew Sylvia's work and who might be willing to complete it the way she would have. That search is ongoing. There is one thing I come back to more than anything else from the past 16 months. In the video recording, near the very end, before she addressed me directly, Sylvia held up one of the annotated statements and said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, "A forged document always contains the forger's assumption about what the other person will not look at closely." Clifford assumed neither of us would examine Schedule B carefully. He was right about Roland. He was wrong about me. He made the mistake that every forger makes. He looked at the person across the table and decided in advance what they were capable of noticing. He underestimated the wrong person. She said this with complete calm. In a workshop that smelled of linseed oil and old paper, 11 days before she died, she had been reading careful forgeries for 30 years. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She documented everything she found and sealed it and hid it where she knew it would survive and where she believed, correctly, that I would eventually find it. She was the most precise person I have ever known. She was also, without question, the bravest.